In March 2022, Brian Houston announced that he was stepping down as the senior pastor of Hillsong Church, a megachurch based in Sydney, Australia. Houston, who co-founded the church with his wife Bobby in 1983, had been the senior pastor for over 30 years. Houston's decision to resign from Hillsong Church came after the church faced a number of controversies and criticisms in recent years, including allegations of financial mismanagement, lack of transparency, and Houston had also faced criticism for his handling of sexual abuse allegations within the church. In 2014, it was revealed that Houston's father, Frank Houston, had sexually abused several children while he was a pastor in New Zealand in the 1970s and 1980s. Brian Houston was criticized for his handling of the allegations, including his decision to not report the abuse to the police and for allegedly downplaying the severity of the abuse. In the last few months, Brian Houston has returned to preaching and traveling. The question I want to ask is, how should we respond to this, and what should we think of it? After around an 8-month hiatus, Brian Houston is returning to ministry. I saw a video recently that was probably put out about a month ago or so, where Brian Houston has announced that he is actually returning, and in this video, Brian Houston shared his side of the story. And his side of the story of what? The side of the story of his resignation from Hillsong Church. And Hillsong Church is a huge global church. If you know anything about the Christian church in the world, you've probably heard of Hillsong. Hillsong has had a lot of different scandals that have followed it, whether it be with Brian Houston himself, Brian Houston's father, which we'll kind of touch on, which I think is actually the most concerning thing in all of this, as well as Carl Lentz. In this video, what I want to do is I want to look at the Brian Houston kind of saga, what all's been going on, and I just want to give some thoughts about this and why it kind of is sad that we continue to see this like repetitive cycle of these big time pastors at these mega churches, and they're failing. So let's get into this. Let's look at this. Let's think about the implications of all the stuff going on with Hillsong and what it means for us as followers of Jesus. Why did Pastor Brian Houston resign? So let's get into it. Hillsong founder and pastor Brian Houston has resigned. Again, this was written in March. From the megachurch after being accused of inappropriate conduct of serious concern against 2 women following an internal investigation. So he was behaving in something that was not good. Pastor Phil Dooley is the acting head of church and announced Houston's resignation during an emergency all-staff meeting on Wednesday. So there's a lot of response and reaction to this. Twitter, this article has some tweets. Hillsong Church founder Brian Houston resigns after internal misconduct investigation. And it's interesting here. You see this hashtag enough is enough. You know, this is something that if people are given a reason to be tired of the church continues to give them reasons to be tired of the church. And these stories make headlines more so than the positive things that the church does. And so it's almost like this uphill battle of people trying to do the right thing. People that are trying to reflect Jesus are not going to get the headlines. The ones that are failing as they say they are reflecting Jesus are the ones that are going to get the headlines. And so that is kind of what's unfortunate in a lot of this. So let's look at this video real quick. This kind of gives some explaining.
The founder of the megachurch Hillsong, Brian Houston, has resigned after an internal investigation found he behaved inappropriately towards 2 women. The acting head of the church, Pastor Phil Dooley, made the announcement at an emergency all-staff meeting. He said Hillsong would launch an independent review of its governance.
We understand there will be much emotion at this news, and we all share these feelings.
Hillsong last week revealed that an investigation into 2 incidents found Mr. Houston had breached the church's moral code of conduct for pastors. Mr. Houston admitted he'd sent inappropriate text messages to a female Hillsong staff member and entered another woman's hotel room while under the influence of alcohol and sleeping tablets.
Yeah, so we kind of get an idea of what he does. So he had texted a female, I guess another employee inappropriately, as well as entered into a hotel room under the influence of alcohol and drugs. So this scandal, all of this is kind of going on in the midst of, like, Hillsong is at its peak. Then you have the stuff with Carl Lentz. We see here that 60 Minutes actually does like this 28-minute long kind of another documentary type thing on Hillsong. Hillsong reacts, their global board, and says, "We've sadly been dealing with 2 complaints made against Pastor Brian over the last 10 years. So the first incident was mentioned in a letter read by Dooley during a meeting. The incident reportedly involved inappropriate text messages, as I've mentioned. And it's really kind of crazy that this is something that's been going on for 10 years. In the midst of all of this, we actually see that Brian Houston is making a return. And in a video that I found on YouTube that wasn't familiar to me, I think it might be like a month and a half, 2 months old, Brian Houston kind of makes this announcement and he's giving his side of the story. And then in the result of the video, he basically says, "I'm returning to ministry. I'm coming back to ministry." So I'm going to play that video so we can kind of look at that together. Really, really interesting stuff that it is this quick of a turnaround amidst some of the other stuff that he has going on.
This conversation is bringing perspective to the story surrounding my resignation, Bobby's termination, and I guess our experiences. So I'll start with my resignation. On March the 21st, 2022, in unison with Bobby, I made the hardest decision of my life, and that was to offer my resignation to the Hillsong Church board after pioneering the church in 1983 and giving 39 years of service. I guess a big part of me hoped that the board, knowing the pressure I was under, would reject my offer and continue to fight for me, but that was not to be. We certainly did not want to just abandon the Hillsong congregation, as some have suggested. We adore the people of Hillsong Church, and to be honest, we miss you all terribly. I've often said the real gold at Hillsong Church is not the music, the lights, and all those external things. The true gold is the people.
Okay, before we kind of go on, I do find it really interesting he mentions here that it's the people that it's all about. And I'm going to make an assumption that the average person that went to Hillsong, of the thousands and thousands, never met Brian Houston. And I'm going to make the assumption as well that, and this is based on what I know about megachurches, that the megachurch pastors are not just walking around in the lobby. They're usually in a green room waiting to come out and speak and then go back. So I just find that, and I'm sure he had some relationship with those people, but the majority of the people that were congregants were not engaging with Brian Houston. And so I just think that some of this is kind of, I don't know, a little bit of BS. But that's my opinion based on an assumption that may not be true.
We've been through utter grief this year as we come to grips with all that has happened and the overwhelming sense of loss as so much and so many we have loved and given our whole life to has been ripped away from us. We would have loved the opportunity to have said a proper goodbye to the Hillsong congregation, but sadly to date, that opportunity has not been afforded to us. I want to be clear. The media and others incorrectly say I resigned because I breached the Hillsong Code of Conduct, but that's just not true. I didn't resign because of my mistakes. I resigned because of the announcements and statements that have been made, which Bobby and I felt made my position untenable. And I spelled out my reasons for my resignation in my resignation letter to the Hillsong Church board. Here are some excerpts that I'll read from my letter to the board, and please note, I didn't see the board's statement of March 18th until after it was made public and was sent to Hillsong's global database. So in direct quotes from my resignation letter, I said, the board's statement to the church has made my position untenable. The board gave enough detail to allow people's imaginations to run wild and draw their own conclusions. The statement did nothing to add my perspective. So understand, I'm reading my resignation letter, just portions of it. So further on, I said the statements that have been made have left me with no choice but to end our time as pastors and leaders of Hillsong Church. And then in another part of my resignation letter, I said, thank you for the opportunity. It has been an honor, and I can truthfully say Hillsong Church is our life's work. I have no intention of retiring, and in the future will still be in ministry, whatever that looks like and wherever that is. My hope is that I could have an active role as founding pastor of our church. That's what I wrote to the board, and that's the resignation that the board were quick to accept. Sadly, in the statements and announcements made, there was enough detail to pour ultimate shame and humiliation on me. but enough ambiguity to leave people to make their own conclusions about what did or didn't happen. Frankly, in many cases, those conclusions are wrong. In my heartfelt apology to the people of Hillsong Church and to the church at large, I spoke about alcohol as having not proven itself to be my friend. But sadly, that has built a narrative out there that I'm an alcoholic.
What do you expect people to think if that's the statement that you made? I mean, I think that that's a pretty normal thing to say. And I get, so what he's trying to say is essentially that he wasn't able to give his side of the story, and that the reports that were put out by Hillsong, he resigned in response to those reports because it made his role as a pastor pretty much like irrespectable or impossible to do, because people had made assumptions. There was no clear picture given to the people as to what he had done. It was just simply these things that he had done, and he resigned in response to that. But I think most people would think that you may have an alcohol problem.
And the stories about my alcoholism that are the result of gossip and whispering and innuendo. The narrative that I'm an alcoholic is false. In fact, I've been told by an expert therapist that I do not display the behaviours that are typical of an alcoholic. My apology was about the specific incidents of which the board are aware, incidents which were unbecoming for a minister of the gospel, and for which I'm deeply sorry. And then prescription medication. It was in the early 2000s, with my constant global travel and the stress I was under, I became dependent on sleeping tablets, which I've spoken about openly many times, including in my book, Live, Love, Lead. But let me be clear. The last time I took a single sleeping tablet was over 10 years ago.
I'll make a quick comment. I also think that this is a symptom of what we have made megachurch pastors to be. He mentions the global travel he was doing and the stress that he was under. No one has forced any of these pastors to take on the platform that they have chosen to take. I've only seen really one pastor leave the public eye as he blew up, and that was Francis Chan. He literally left the church that he was at because it was growing so big and people were coming for him. So I just don't think that that's a really good excuse. And I think that's not Brian Houston's fault. That is the fault of something deeper within the church.
Even though I've continued to travel widely, I haven't taken even one sleeping tablet for a decade. It's not an ongoing problem. And the notorious night in 2019, where I mixed a double dose of anti-anxiety tablets with alcohol, was a one-off occasion. It happened once. It hadn't happened before, and it hasn't happened since. So I don't have an ongoing problem with anti-anxiety tablets or any other prescription medication. And I respectfully ask you to please not label me that way or blindly accept that narrative. So in January, I announced to the church that I was stepping aside for 12 months. So our departure from Hillsong was actually a progression. When over 12 months ago I was charged with a crime that I'm yet to defend and that I will fight, I was told I would need to step down as chairman of the board, which I did. Then later, I was told I could no longer be on the board, so I stepped aside. And that was followed a couple of months later when I was told I needed to step back from all ministry for 12 months until my court case had been settled. And then eventually, I believe, I was squeezed out altogether. Please know, I know some people don't understand why I'm preaching after I read a prepared statement to the church on January the 31st, which was approved by the board and indicated that I would step aside for 12 months, and now within that 12-month period, I'm traveling and speaking again. But it wasn't my choice to step aside from preaching and leading. It was a requirement of my employers. And of course, sadly, I'm no longer an employee of Hillsong Church. And from December the 5th, 2021, the last time I preached at Hillsong Church, it was 9 months of not standing on a platform or speaking publicly at all. But at the end of August, I started speaking in various cities every week in the USA, which has been a rich tonic for my soul. We're so grateful for the open embrace we've received from so many within the body of Christ all over the globe. Bobby and I have made no firm decisions on what our future may look like, but I'm believing for an extremely fruitful next decade. We're holding on to a scripture I've used multiple times to encourage others. Being confident of this very thing, he who has begun a good work in you will complete it.
Okay, so he mentions there that he is actually returning to speaking, and he's been speaking every week at different churches. And what my thing is, when these guys return to these roles, it's never like a small role that they return to. It's always like right back in the center and at the forefront that they were before. And I get it's probably hard to let go of these roles that they have, these big time like speaking deals and book deals and all these things. But I think that's the issue, is that what we find over and over again is that it is these guys that feel the need to be at the forefront or to be in control of their situation are the ones that continue to fail. And I think it's a disservice to these people and their character and the church as a whole when we just simply don't get all the information or figure out full innocence until we let these people start like speaking again and teaching again. Like I actually had found one of these churches on here where they actually, this is James River Church. Brian Houston speaks there.
How good it is to be at James River Church. You guys, fantastic. Just stay standing for one moment, all right? You can sit for a long...
So yeah, this was literally 3 months ago when all this is going on. And you know, it's just kind of like crazy to me that like how fast these guys can go back into the ministry. And I'm not saying that Brian Houston is guilty, but I just think like obviously he did some things, and there's probably more to the story than what either perspective may be giving. But what I find to be the biggest issue in all of this is the one that he is actually going to trial for, and that is the situation with his dad. And if you don't know anything about his dad was actually involved with child abuse. And what we'll do is I have like a video that we can kind of look at real quick, and I'll kind of give some thoughts on that. But I think that that's also really, really problematic. So this video right here.
Hillsong leader Brian Houston has dropped a courtroom bombshell right on the head of former New South Wales Police Commissioner Andrew Scipione. Houston is defending a charge of concealing his own father's sexual abuse of a child, and today he's claimed that the former top cop was also aware and did nothing about it.
A defiant Brian Houston said today that given his time over, he would do the same thing again and not report his knowledge of his father's sexual offending to police. When he learned his father, Frank Houston, had abused a boy, the victim was already in his late 30s, he says, and adamant he didn't want the police involved. He would think I was betraying him, I'd let him down, and I think he'd be incredibly angry had he gone to police, Brian Houston told the court. It took more than 2 years before Houston addressed his Hillsong congregation, revealing his father's crimes, but he told the court among the faithful was the future police commissioner, Andrew Scipione. Did he know your father was a pedophile? Asked Houston's barrister. I am certain he did, he replied, claiming not one police officer in his congregation ever suggested he make a formal statement. When he first learnt of his father's crimes, Brian Houston said his father assured him it was a one-off when he was emotionally low. In what Brian Houston called a pitiful attempt to atone for his sins, he says Frank paid his victim $2,000. Brian Houston later met with a lawyer to help arrange a further $10,000 payment, but claimed it was never to buy the victim's silence. Within months of that payment, Brian Houston says he was contacted by the Assemblies of God in New Zealand, where more victims were coming forward. One said he'd been abused by Frank Houston in Brian's own childhood bedroom. My stomach dropped, said Houston. I have no doubt now my father was a serial pedophile, and we will probably never know the full extent of it. Despite that, he claims by the time he knew, he didn't consider any more children to be at risk because of his father's age and failing health. Frank Houston died in 2004. Andrew Scipione attended the funeral. Hugh Remington for 10 News First.
So Brian Houston has admitted that he knew about these cases and these things that occurred with his dad and these children that were being abused, but by the time he found out, they were in their 30s, so he didn't feel like it was necessary. And the person asked them not to, but I think there's some things to take into consideration. One being he has to realize the role that he is in as a leader, as a pastor of a globally known church. And if this comes out, obviously people are going to question him. And then secondly, I think just for the sake of maybe other people who may be afraid to speak out on what his dad did, I really don't know the specifics of each individual, but maybe there are people that if Brian Houston were to come forward, someone as big as he is were to speak out against it, right? Maybe they would feel brave enough to do that. And I think that this could have been an opportunity for Hillsong to publicly walk alongside these people who had been abused or been hurt and be the church to them. Maybe they did that. They mentioned giving money, but that's kind of weird because it just seems like that's just to keep them quiet, but they say it wasn't. So this whole situation, whether it be the allegations that he's gone through, whether it be the stuff dealing with his dad, which I think is the more serious thing because I think there's just so much there. There's so much hurt and pain that we've seen the church cause to vulnerable people that can't defend themselves and children by the church. I think it's horrible. All of that together is just this mess that is not glorifying to who Jesus is, what he calls us to, who he is, and what the church is supposed to be in living out Jesus and his message. And so, for us as followers of Jesus, how do we respond to this? I'm really struggling to give grace to this situation because I feel like it's someone that has continually had these things happen over and over again, and they continue to get bailed out in some kind of way, and they're given this big platform to misrepresent Jesus continually. What do you think? I'd love to hear maybe some of your thoughts in the comments. How should we respond to this Brian Houston situation? Should Brian Houston be back in leadership position? Should he be traveling to churches preaching every week as he's going through a case, as he's dealing with these allegations, as he's been fired from a church 9 months ago? What should he do? What is the right thing? And what do you think? So I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Leave a comment, like this video, subscribe to our channel. I just am really open to conversation about the church and how we should respond in these situations that are messy and how we can better look like Jesus in all that we do. Thank you for tuning into this video. I am Blake, and this is Rethinking Christianity.